Hello everyone. Under one of my comments, someone asked me about the importance of different stats and later commented that I should do a video on it. I thought this was a good idea, so that's what I'll be doing today. I'll be looking at every stat and talking about their importance at the early and late stages of Darkrise. The reason I'm talking about different stages is because some stats become more or less important as you progress through the game. I'll also talk about the importance of a stat and how it might change depending on your class. I'll be referring to Archer and Warrior in this video. I won't be talking about Mage because I don't play Mage anymore and so don't have enough knowledge about this class. At the end of every kind of stat, I'll try and give like a little rating just to like visualize how important or unimportant the stat is. We'll be looking at the offensive stats to begin with, and therefore the first stat we're going to be starting with is damage. Now you might think that damage is the most important stat in the whole of Darkrise, and it is very much an important stat, especially when you start the game. When you are, level 1, you're in the first area and you're trying to progress through the game, damage is, I would say, the most important stat. And the reason for this is because obviously the biggest focus at the beginning is leveling up, killing enemies, and you won't have any passive abilities, potions, enchanted equipment, so you are really reliant on your base damage to progress through the game. So it is a very important stat. As you progress through the game and you start getting passive abilities, you start having potions, you start enchanting your equipment, critical severity starts getting into play, critical rate starts getting into play, armor pen starts getting into play, your base damage will be far less important. And I would say that by the time you reach Fatal Bridge and you're trying to complete it on Fatal difficulty, damage is going to be something you're not focusing on anymore. In terms of the max amount of damage you're going to be needing for Fatal Bridge, before it used to be 18k, that used to be the recommended amount. I think that's probably gone down a bit after the update because enemies are weaker now, so I'd say about 16k. Remember, you will have potions and stuff, you'll have passive abilities, so this will obviously make your damage higher. But overall, I would say damage is a very important stat. It becomes less important towards the end of the game, and I would say in terms of both classes, it is an important stat. I would say a 7 out of 10, maybe an 8 out of 10. The next stat we're going to be looking at is Haste. Now, Haste is how fast you attack. So if you're an archer, this is how many arrows you shoot and how fast you shoot them. If you're a warrior, this is how fast you're swinging your sword. And compared to damage, this is not very important at all. When you first start the game, early stages, you're kind of a low level, level 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, that kind of level. I would definitely not be thinking about Haste at all. You've got far more important things to worry about and far more important stats to try and improve, so I wouldn't look at Haste at all. As you progress through the game, you might pick up Haste, a couple of Haste stats here and there. If you're using unique items, unique weapons, you'll probably end up, getting Haste in there, so you probably will naturally increase your Haste. But overall, although it is quite cool, especially if you're an archer, shooting arrows really fast to the point you become like almost a cannon is quite cool. But overall, Haste isn't, I would say, a useful or important stat to have. It's probably like a 5 out of 10. It's useful because obviously it means that you can do more damage quickly, but compared to the other stats, not that important at all. The next stat we're going to be looking at is armor penetration. Now, armor penetration is the ability for your attacks to ignore enemy defense. In other words, if you have high armor pen, it doesn't matter what defense the enemies have, you'll be able to cut through this and do more damage to your enemy. Now, armor pen is really interesting because when you first start the game and you're at the early stages of the game, armor pen is not very important at all. And the reason for this is because when you are a lower level and you're just progressing through the game, you're going to tend to do areas on normal difficulty, and this means the defense that enemies have is going to be lower, and so there's no need for you to have high armor pen. However, as you start doing areas on fatal difficulty, enemies will have higher defense, and therefore you're going to need armor pen to cut through this defense. Now, I actually have a story about this. Before I joined the Darkrise Discord, I didn't really have a good idea of how important certain stats were. So I joined the Discord because I was struggling with Ancient Fortress, which is the level 130 area, and I was doing it on fatal difficulty. I had good stats, but I just couldn't clear it. I was struggling, and that's when someone told me to increase my armor penetration. My armor pen at the time was 30%. I increased it to 60%, and when I tell you that my attacks became so much more better, so much more lethal, and I was able to clear Ancient Fortress, it was such a huge change for me, and that obviously shows you how important armor pen actually is. Now, when you're doing fatal bridge, you know, that's bridge of stagnation on fatal difficulty, you're obviously going to encounter enemies with lots of defense, and this is where armor penetration becomes really important. So I would say at the beginning, armor pen is not very important, but as you go through the game and you start doing areas of fatal difficulty, armor pen is really important, and it's going to be one of those kind of stats that you're always going to try and improve. You're always going to try and get higher and higher. It's less important after the update, but I still think it's an important stat to have, and an important stat that you will want to try and improve continuously. So I would say it's like a 7 to 8 out of 10 stat as well. Now we're going to be looking at critical rate and critical severity. The reason why I'm doing these separate stats together is because you need to realize how important they are in combination. There's no point having one that's really high if the other one's really low. Now, critical rate is the chance you have to do a critical hit. For example, if you have 100% critical rate, you're going to be doing a critical hit all the time. Critical severity is how much damage you're going to be doing every time you do a critical hit. If you have really high critical severity, your damage is going to be high. The reason why I'm doing them together and why you need to have them both really high is because let's say you have 100% critical rate, but your critical severity is very low. This means you're going to be doing critical hits all the time, but the amount of critical damage you're doing is really low. Vice versa, let's say you have really high critical severity but like only 10% critical rate. This means when you do a critical hit, you'll do a lot of damage, but you won't be doing them very often because your critical rate is so low. Now, because of how they work together, when you first start the game, you're probably not going to want to use these because you're obviously going to have to improve both of them. And so therefore, if you want to increase your damage, you're probably just going to, increase your base damage. However, as you progress through the game and as you reach fatal bridge, you're going to want to improve critical rate and critical severity, as this will give you far more damage. Critical rate, you're going to want to increase it to not 100%, but around, I think, 95% to 97%. And this is because there's an adaptation passive which increases this to 100%. In terms of critical severity, there is something called a ferocity rune, which improves your critical severity when you use it. But overall, you're going to probably want to keep increasing this and making this better as you level up and improve your character. So I would say that at the beginning, these stats are not very important because they're very complex, and so you're better off just improving your damage. However, towards the end, as you're doing Fatal Bridge, they become far more important. The next stat we're going to be looking at is skill recovery. Now, skill recovery is about how fast your active skills cool down. In other words, if you have high skill recovery, then your active skills will cool down faster and you'll be able to use them more often. Now, this skill isn't very useful because number one, a lot of your skills will have no cooldown at all, so it won't be affected by skill recovery. And also, if you're a character that doesn't use mana at all, you're someone that doesn't spam skills, then again, skill recovery isn't very useful. The only time that I would say skill recovery is a bit important is if you're a warrior. And the reason why is because if you're a warrior, you're going to want to have berserker mode on all the time, because berserker mode will improve both your attacking skills and your defensive skills. So as a result, to have berserker mode on all the time, you are going to want to have, I think it's about 40 or 50% skill recovery to allow berserker mode to be on basically all the time. But apart from this, skill recovery is a very useless stat. I would say it's like a 3 out of 10. The last offensive stat that we're going to be looking at is control power, and I almost forgot to do this, which shows you how useless it is. I forgot to do this. I've only just remembered that this is also in the offensive stat bit. Control power basically controls how long your enemies suffer with conditions that you put on them. So for example, if you hit your enemy and they get stunned, if you have good control power, they'll be stunned for longer. This is pretty useless. You'd want your enemies to die straight away. You wouldn't even want them to be suffering conditions. The only time I would say it's even a tiny bit important is if you have the oppression rune as a warrior, because a warrior has, using ground slam, will be able to stun his enemies, and if you have good control power, they'll be stunned for longer, which means you'll be able to do more damage. But then again, you're just going to want to kill them early. So as a result, control power is a really useless stat to have. My current archer doesn't have any control power at all. It's like a 1 out of 10 stat. You don't really need it. There's no point wasting your time trying to improve this at all. Now we're moving on to the defensive stats, and we're going to start with health. And health is another example of how the importance of a stat can change as you progress through the game. Now, health, which if you didn't know, is how much kind of hit points you have, health points you have, so how much damage you can take before you die. And when you start the game, when you're at the early stages of the game, I would say that health is almost as important, if not more important, than damage. And the reason why is because when you start the game, obviously you have no passive abilities. You'll have very little block rate, block severity, defense. You'll have no protection with runes. You'll be really exposed. And so having a lot of health is really, really important, because obviously you don't want to die. However, as you progress through the game, you gain more passive abilities, your block rate increases, your block severity increases, your defense increases, you get, the immunity rune, the magic shield runes, maybe you have energy shield, your attack improves, so you're less likely to get hit by enemies. All of a sudden, having so much health is really unimportant, and my archer actually has very low health, which just shows you how, as time goes on, your health and how much health you have is not very important. If you're a warrior, I think this is one of those things where it also changes with class, because if you're a warrior, you're probably going to want to have slightly more health than an archer, because a warrior, its attacks are more short range, and so you're less likely to get hit. More likely to get hit, whereas if you're an archer, you're a long range attack, so you can just run away and shoot from long range. So health at the beginning, when you're lower level, very, very important. Towards the end, as you're reaching Fatal Bridge, not so important. So I'd say at the beginning, it's like a 9 out of 10 stat. Towards the end, it's like a 4 out of 10 stat. So overall, it's like a 6 out of 10 stat. Now we're going to be looking at Energy Shield. Energy Shield, I mentioned this when I was talking about health. Energy Shield is kind of like extra health. Basically, what happens is, let's say you have Energy Shield. When you get attacked, your Energy Shield goes down first, and it's only when your Energy Shield reaches 0, then you start taking damage with health. The only difference between health and Energy Shield is that you can't really heal Energy Shield, and when you're being attacked, if you're being under attack, you're getting hit, your Energy Shield won't recover. Energy Shield at the beginning of the game can be an important thing to have, because obviously, like I said, it's literally extra health, and especially if you don't have that much, normal health, Energy Shield is kind of great. However, as you go and you progress through the game, you get higher level, you increase your block rate, block severity, defense, you hit, runes. Having Energy Shield isn't very important. So if you have Energy Shield, it's kind of nice, but I would say that there are better ways to protect yourself from damage and death than having energy shield. So I would say it's an okay stat to have, but not a very important one to focus on. So I would say this is like a 5 out of 10 stat. Now it's time to look at health regen, and I really hate this stat because it's not very useful, but it's on so many unique items, so you can't avoid it. Now, health regen is about recovery. If you take damage and you have high health regen, it means that you will recover a bigger portion of your health quicker. Now, you might think that actually, quoted, this does sound like an important stat to have because health recovery is great. And if you are a lower level character starting the game, you might think this is really important. And it is to an extent because you don't have heal wave when you start the game, so you have limited options to heal when you take damage. So having said that, if you're a warrior, you do have berserker mode, and berserker mode does have a healing effect, so less important if you're a warrior. Health regen is also quite good if you want to get to Underwater Town really early, because Underwater Town is quite hard to get to if you don't have heal wave. But if you have a lot of health regen, then you'll be able to regenerate enough health to keep yourself alive and keep yourself from drowning. However, when you progress through the game and you start getting block severity, block rate, you know, those type of stats, you'll realize how useless health regen is, because number one, you'll be taking less damage anyway. Number two, you'll have heal wave, so if you start taking damage, you're just going to use heal wave. There's also balls of health that drop from enemies, so you can use that to heal yourself too. Like health regen is just something that isn't very useful, not very important, and as time goes on, you're probably going to get annoyed when you get so much of it. So next stat we look at is defense, and this stat is far more important than health regen. Now, I mentioned defense when I was talking about armor penetration, because armor penetration is the stat used to counter this. But obviously you do have defense just like enemies do, and defense basically reduces the amount of damage you take from enemies, which is obviously kind of nice to have. Defense when you start the game out is to an extent important. If you can get it, it is important. Not important as health, I would say, but it's still pretty important. I would focus on defense before I would focus on block rate and block severity, simply because it's easier to, you know, get, because block rate and block severity, you have to focus on them both, but defense is just one stat. Once you progress through the game, it still retains its importance. I think when you progress through the game and you reach, you know, areas like Fatal Bridge, block rate and block severity become more important. But overall, I would say defense is obviously an important stat to have. Is great if you can have it at around 70%, maybe 80%, if you can even 90%. But compared to block rate, block severity, probably not as important. So I would say for defense, I would say it's a 6 or 7 out of 10 stat. Speaking of block rate and block severity, let's talk about these stats now. Just like critical rate and critical severity, I'm going to talk about these stats together, because without block rate, block severity is pretty useless, and without block severity, block rate is pretty useless. Now, block rate is the chance you have to block damage. So if you have 100% block rate, you'll be blocking everything. If you have really high block severity, this is how much damage you block. So, you know, high block severity equals high damage blocked. I don't believe that 100% block severity means that you're blocking all damage. I think there's still some damage that doesn't get blocked, but if you have high block severity, it means that you'll be blocking a high proportion of damage that you receive. Now, obviously, like I said, it's important that you focus on these two stats together. When you start the game out and you're obviously a lower level character, you can focus on this when you can, but I would say that this isn't very important to begin with, because number one, you'll be doing areas on normal difficulty, so you shouldn't be facing too much damage, and also it's just far easier to just increase your health instead, because, you know, health is just easier to improve than block rate and severity. However, as you progress through the game, block rate and block severity become really important. When you want to do Fatal Bridge, so that's Bridge of Salvation on Fatal difficulty, it is really recommended that you have basically near enough 100% block rate. Obviously, you'll have the adaptation passive that will help you with this. You'll have potions, you'll have enchantments to help you with this, but you really want to get block rate to effectively 100% because you're going to want to block everything. Once you have block rate at 100%, that's when you really look at block severity and getting this to as high as possible so that you're blocking as much damage. These two are really important stats, really important defensive stats. If you have these that are really high, you're in a great position when you're doing Fatal Bridge. So I would say this is 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 stats. They are really important in late stage Darkrise. The last defensive stat that we're going to be talking about is control resistance. Now, earlier we mentioned control power, which is how much you can control your enemies. Control resistance is how much you can stop enemies controlling you. In other words, if you have high control resistance, enemies will find it difficult to stun you and stuff. Control resistance is completely useless. Even if you get stunned, it's not the end of the world. It's not that bad. Yes, it's annoying, but in the grand scheme of things, unless you're, you know, getting controlled by a lot of enemies simultaneously, then it can be annoying. But if it's just one enemy controlling you or a few enemies, it's not that bad. And anyway, you should be killing them anyway. Control resistance is also especially useless for warrior, because a lot of warriors active skills also have control immunity or some control immunity, so you won't even need this much if you're a warrior as well. So, you know, not a very important stat, very useless. Don't focus on it at all. This is a, you know, 2 out of 10 stat. The final group of stats that we're going to be looking at are the special stats, and the first special stat is mana. Now, mana is what you use to carry out your active skills. Some of them, the active skills, don't require mana, they're free, but some of them you do need some mana to activate, so if you don't have any mana, you can't use them. Mana at the beginning of Darkrise, when you just start out your like really low level, is not that useful because you won't have any active skills to use, and even if you do have active skills, your active skills will be really low level, not very great. However, as you progress through the game, mana can be a very nice thing to have when you have a lot of it. Now, it depends on how you play Darkrise. I'm an archer, my main character's an archer, and I don't really use active skills, and so having a lot of mana makes no sense, so mana is useless to me. However, if you're a warrior especially, and you have a warrior that uses a lot of skills, I call this the fake mage warrior because it spams skills like ground slam. If you're that kind of player and you're using warrior like that, then obviously mana is very important, because having a lot of mana allows you to spam these skills. So I'm not going to give a rating, it really just depends on how you play Darkrise. Next, we have mana regen. Mana regen is how much your mana regenerates over time, how much it recovers. Again, this very much depends on how much mana you use. If you use a lot of mana, then having high mana regen obviously can be quite useful. If you don't use mana regen is pretty trash and not very useful at all. So again, this very much depends on how you use mana. The last stat we're going to be looking at in this video is mobility. Now, mobility affects how fast you move. If you have high mobility, you're going to move faster. It's not a very important stat. It doesn't really affect much apart from, you know, how fast you move. Being able to run really fast is quite nice. Being able to just run across maps is great. And if you have high mobility and you go to really low mobility, it is really painful because you'll notice how slow you are. But overall, it's not very important. You have better things to worry about, and also when you reach Bridge of Stagnation, you're going to be surrounded anyway, so you won't be able to move very much. You'll just keep running into enemies, which in itself isn't great either. So it's like a 2 out of 10 stat, not very important at all.